When I heard that Eli Roth was going to dip his toe back into the directing ring with a throwback slasher movie around Thanksgiving set in a town in Massachusetts, I couldn't have been more excited and looking forward to this movie more than I was going in. Admittedly, I have had a bit of a checkered past with Eli Roth's movies in the past, with some good and some not so good. But for this, I was cautiously optimistic. Anyway, Thanksgiving is a 2023 movie about a killer on the loose in a small town that is killing people responsible for a Black Friday tragedy the year before. Now, the incident in question here happened at a local retail store on Black Friday when, through a series of elevated situations, were then urged on by a raging mob for a free waffle iron, the crowd gets more and more incensed and ends up causing the deaths of several local townsfolk. Now, we flash forward a year later, and the town is still kind of reeling from that incident. And yet, the local store is once again planning another Black Friday sale. However, in the days leading up to that sale, several deaths begin to occur around the people that took part in the mob riot. Now, the movie mostly centers around Jessica, who's the daughter of the store owner where the riot took place, and her friends, I guess high school friends. It seems like they're all seniors in high school, as they all seem to get tagged in this particular social media post, which has the recent victims sitting around a Thanksgiving table, and their names are on empty place cards also at the table. Now, in terms of plot, this movie doesn't really use one. Yes, there is a mystery at the center of who's doing all these killings, but there's really nothing that the main characters do that's any help in solving any of this. They do kind of come up with certain tasks to do, but it feels more like it's just sort of busy work in order for people to get from one scene to the next scene in order for the killer to kind of do his thing. None of the things that they actually do by this main group of kids helps anyone solve anything at any moment. Now, they're only actually able to solve it basically when the killer just shows up at the end and then makes a momentary mistake about his identity. Now, of course, none of this is really a sin when it comes to slasher movies. These movies are always kind of light on plot. Now, back in the late 70s, early 80s, when this genre became a big thing, most of the characters never even knew what the hell was going on until they were just murdered. So then usually it'd be one character, the final girl, who would start finding bodies lying around and then realize, well, something's up. And then there would be some sort of final battle that would ensue. It was sort of more of a, I don't know, maybe I'd say an innocent or maybe earnest style of the genre, which kind of did begin to take on a lot of water with all the oversaturation of it by the end of the decade. And then sort of the 90s came and sort of twisted that around a little bit and made a much more kind of self-aware meta version with more of an edgy, savvy, kind of sarcastic characters that, that were not only aware of the tropes that had come before them, but they also became more aware of the situation that was happening around them. They kind of took more of an active approach and role in the story that they were in. No longer did everyone just sort of stand around and wait for death. Now they actively tried to solve the murders themselves and be a bit more proactive. Now, for me, I'm kind of pulled in two directions here. Now, on the one hand, there are a lot of these old 80s style genre movies that I still really love. And yet, I've always kind of railed against the idea of passive protagonists. On the other hand, although I've never been a huge fan of the 90s horror movies, I think some of the things that the 90s movies introduced was a net positive in general and allowed other movies to sort of build on top of that and allow the horror movies to kind of flourish in a different way. And it allowed it to bring kind of a new way of doing the same type of film and able to sort of refresh a genre that at the time was desperately in need of one. The thing that's so puzzling about this movie in particular is it seemed to try to ride that line between those two styles of 80s and 90s. And it kind of just wanted to have these mindless killing of characters in very over-the-top gruesome ways, much like the sort of fabled 80s style, but it also wanted to have the main characters to be aware of the problems and attack it themselves. However, nothing the characters did really mattered in any way, so I don't know what the point of that was. Like, this is where I think the movie falters for the most part for me. Like, it can't kind of pick a lane, so it ends up serving neither. Like, I found myself bouncing between two schools of thought here. Like, is this movie just really stupid, or is this a very, very clever satire? Now, the beginning of this movie, the way it's kind of set up, is set up to be a very clever satire. And it's a satirical look at sort of Thanksgiving and also slasher movies in general. Like, there is a clear social commentary here on the whole Black Friday mess that we currently find ourselves in. The first thing that I noticed is the dialogue is kind of terrible, and the characters are super over the top, unlikable. But that doesn't mean it still can't be satire. That's just sort of what they're introducing. The problem actually comes in that it doesn't go far enough to actually be a satire. Instead, it just sort of ends up falling into the same tropes without making any sort of commentary on what those tropes are in general. It also pulls back on harming any of the core people in the movie, which is odd because, Roth cut his teeth on films that were largely nihilistic and no-holds-barred scripts where almost no one was safe. And he didn't seem to care who died. It kind of part of that sort of Gen X burn the world attitude. But here, this plays out like just another Scream knockoff, except the characters are too stupid and the dialogue is relatively pointless to actually be a part of the story. It's just sort of there to get you to the next scene. Like, there's even a moment where they do this sort of Scream thing where the kids are all sitting around trying to like Scooby-Doo this mystery. And yet there are some truly head scratchers in how they do it. Like, when they think they know exactly who the killer is because they saw some security camera footage of one guy hugging a security guard. They were all just convinced now that he did it. Even that same guy's girlfriend was 100% convinced that he was the murderer. Like, why? What does that even prove? Like, it just felt like nothing really added up in any way that the characters thought it did. But it was stuff to do, and it was reason to go here and there and set up kind of different set pieces. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of the Scream series, but at least that does tend to build on the info that kind of comes before it. Maybe not so much in the later ones, but certainly in the earlier ones. And also in the Scream movies, that the body count of the made kids does sort of get up there. Like, where this movie kind of goes to great lengths to keep almost everyone alive, it just kind of feels like an effort is being made here, like every goddamn movie now, to simply birth a franchise. And so in that instance, well, you don't kill anyone important because you need to keep them around for a sequel. Now, back in like the 80s, you just kind of killed everyone, and then you just needed to figure out the next movie. Like, rarely, if you look at some of the franchises back, like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, rarely did the actual characters jump from movie sequel to movie sequel. It usually was a new set of characters each movie, with some minor exceptions. I will say this, the kills and gore is fantastic. Roth does not hold back when it comes to actual kills and really lets it fly. But because there seems to be plot armor over the main cast for the entire movie, it does feel like he has one hand tied behind his back the entire film. I look at the recent movie X by Ty West, who also had a similar style throwback horror movie, but he was not afraid to put everyone in harm's way. And at the time, it really was a little bit of an unknown as to who was going to make it out or if anyone was. But with this movie, it set itself up with a great concept to go full throttle and blast through all those weak slasher wannabes out there with a no-holds-barred, relentless experience. But instead, he kind of pulls back at the last minute and just comes across as a bit of a weak clone of the 90s slasher movies instead of a genre-defining resurgence of a great director. I'd give this movie a C-, but let me know what you think.